Welcome to Lucid Dreams History. These are 30-plus true stories about the Industrial Revolution for you to fall asleep to. Sweet lucid dreams. The Sparks in Soho. James Watt's Long Night, 1765. The rain had been falling over Birmingham for hours, slicking the cobblestones in a sheen that reflected the flickering gas lamps. The year was 1765, and the city was alive with the clank and hiss of 1,000 forges. The air smelled of coal smoke and wet iron, a smell James Watt had grown accustomed to over the past decade. In the corner of his cramped workshop in the Soho manufactory, a machine sat in pieces, a Newcomen steam engine cylinder, its brass surface dulled from years of use in a Cornish tin mine. It was this stubborn piece of metal that had kept Watt from sleep for nights on end. He had been tasked to repair it, but repair was not enough. Watt's restless mind whispered that it could be made better, that the machine that groaned and hissed and wasted steam could be transformed into something leaner, faster, and more powerful. But tonight nothing seemed to fit. The gears stuck, the valves leaked, and the temperature of the boiler was dangerously inconsistent. Matthew Bolton, his business partner, had already hinted that investors were growing impatient. Watt rubbed his tired eyes, reached for his notebook, and began to scribble figures by candlelight. In the dark silence between the ticking of his clock, he thought about his childhood in Greenock, the long days spent carving models of cranes and windmills, and the smell of the shipyard where his father built vessels for the Atlantic trade. He remembered the awe he felt the first time he saw a steam engine, its great beam rising and falling like the arm of a giant, and how that moment had convinced him that steam, not wind or water, was the future. That night Watt's pencil stopped moving mid-equation. He stared at the figures. What if the steam didn't have to fill and empty the entire cylinder each time? What if he could condense it in a separate chamber, keeping the main cylinder hot? His pulse quickened. This would save enormous amounts of fuel. His mind raced faster than his pencil could keep up, and by dawn, the first sketch of the separate condenser was on paper. Weeks later, the first prototype sat gleaming in the Soho workshop. When it roared to life, its smooth, powerful strokes filled the room with a rhythmic heartbeat. Watt and Bolton stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the future unfold in brass and steel. Soon, his improved engine would power textile mills, pump water from deep mines, and drive Britain into a new age of industry. Outside, the rain had stopped, and sunlight spilled over the rooftops. Birmingham's chimneys sent their smoke skyward like black banners announcing the arrival of a new era. The Children of Cromford, Arkwright's Mill, 1771. The Derwent River ran fast and cold that March morning, its surface misted with the breath of winter. Richard Arkwright stood on the stone bridge, his eyes fixed on the 3-story brick mill he had built beside the water. The Cromford Mill was unlike anything Derbyshire had seen, a factory designed not for men with tools, but for machines with teeth and claws of steel. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp cotton and the grinding whir of water frames. A belt-driven forest of spinning rollers stretched across the floor, each one twisting and drawing raw fibers into fine threads. Arkwright's invention, a system that used water power to spin cotton at an unprecedented speed, had turned the sleepy village into a humming nerve center of production. But the machines needed hands, and those hands were often small. Arkwright's overseers had gone into surrounding towns to recruit children, orphans from parish houses, sons and daughters of farmers struggling to feed themselves, promising them work, shelter, and food. 12-year-old Mary Shaw was one of them. She had arrived a month ago, clutching the hem of her thin dress as she was led through the mill's gates. Today, she worked alongside 30 other children in the spinning room, feeding cotton into rollers with quick, nervous fingers. The noise was constant, the clattering rhythm of wood and iron, the slap of leather belts, the deep groan of the water wheel turning below. Overseer Robert Ashcroft strode the aisles, eyes sharp for mistakes. A single snarl in the thread could jam the rollers and cost the factory precious minutes. Mary's knuckles were raw from straightening fibers, and once, when her sleeve caught in the rollers, the machine pulled her hand in before she yanked it back, skin scraped and bleeding. Ashcroft gave her no more than a curt glare. Lost time was the only injury that mattered to him. When the bell rang for the midday break, Mary and the others filed into the yard, clutching bowls of thin porridge. They ate standing, steam from their breath mingling with the mist off the river. The older boys spoke of running away, of slipping out at night and following the Derwent south until they reached a bigger town. But Cromford was remote, and most of the children had nowhere else to go. Arkwright himself rarely walked the factory floor, but when he did, he seemed to radiate an unshakable belief in his creation. He spoke of progress, of Britain leading the world in cloth production, of jobs for the poor, of wealth for the nation. And in some ways, he was right. By the end of the decade, mills like Cromford's would multiply along the rivers of England, their water wheels churning day and night. For Mary, the mill was both cage and lifeline. It gave her bread and a roof, but it also took her childhood hour by hour, turn by turn of the rollers. Years later, when steam replaced water power and Cromford's wheel finally stilled, she would remember the way the mill's windows glowed in the pre-dawn darkness, a beacon for some, a prison lamp for others. The smog over Manchester, life in the first industrial city, 1805. The first thing a newcomer noticed about Manchester in 1805 wasn't the roar of its mills, nor the endless rows of brick terraces. It was the air. A dense, yellow-brown haze hung over the city like an unwashed curtain, carrying the tang of coal smoke, hot oil, and wet cotton dust. Even in summer, the sun often rose as a pale disk, its light filtering weakly through the industrial fog. Thomas Whitworth had arrived from the countryside 3 months ago, lured by promises of steady wages in the spinning mills. Back in his village, the air had smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. Here, every breath was a lungful of soot. The factory bell clanged at 6 each morning, dragging him from his straw mattress in the workers' lodging house. By 1:30, he was at his station, a floor crowded with mules and looms, their wooden arms clacking in an unending mechanical chorus. The spinning mule was a marvel of engineering, but it was also a fickle master. Threads snapped constantly, and it was Thomas's job to repair them before the whole machine snarled into a useless tangle. He worked 12 hours a day, with only a half-hour break for bread and cheese at midday. The overseer carried a cane, more for intimidation than assistance, and woe to the spinner who slowed the pace. Outside the mill, Manchester was swelling beyond recognition. Streets once lined with cottages now bristled with lodging houses, taverns, and pawnbrokers. The River Irwell, once clear enough to fish, now ran black with dye and mill waste. Its banks were littered with heaps of ash and broken machinery. But for every complaint, there were those who called it progress. Merchants whose warehouses overflowed with cloth bound for London, Liverpool, and beyond. At night, Thomas would walk home through Ancoats, the world's first industrial suburb, where factory chimneys pierced the skyline like giant black needles. He often passed groups of children hauling coal in wicker baskets or scavenging scraps of cotton from the gutters to sell back to the mills. Fires burned in street braziers, giving the smog a lurid orange glow. One evening, a sudden downpour hit and Thomas ducked under a doorway with a man named Samuel, a weaver from Salford. They spoke in low tones about the rumors sweeping the city, talk of workers banding together to demand shorter hours, safer machines, better wages. "It's dangerous talk," Samuel warned, glancing over his shoulder. "But the bosses won't listen unless we make them." The rain slowed, but the smog never lifted. The next morning, the city woke to the same dull haze, the same relentless bell, the same clattering machines. Manchester was the beating heart of the Industrial Revolution and its choking lungs. The frame breakers, the Luddite Rising of 1812. The wind off the Pennine Hills was sharp that March night in 1812, carrying with it the faint smell of coal smoke from the valley mills. In the darkness near Huddersfield, A dozen men gathered in a barn, their faces lit by a single tallow candle. They wore woolen scarves pulled high over their mouths, caps drawn low over their eyes. In the center of the room lay their purpose: heavy wooden mallets, iron bars, and sledgehammers. The leader, known only as General Ludd, a name whispered more than spoken, unrolled a crude map of the nearby mill. "We go in quiet," he said. "We break every frame, smash the gears, burn what we can. Leave the building standing, but no machine works come morning." These men were stocking frame knitters, weavers, and spinners, their livelihood stripped away by the new mechanized looms. For generations, their craft had been steady work done at home or in small workshops. Now, factory owners installed wide-framed looms that could be run by unskilled labor, often women and children, at a fraction of the pay. It wasn't just wages being cut. It was pride, independence, and the future of their trade. When the church bell struck midnight, the Luddites moved out. Their boots crunched over frost-hardened ground, their hammers wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. The mill stood dark against the sky, its great windows reflecting a pale slice of moon. They forced the side door and spilled inside, their shadows stretching across the floor of sleeping machinery. The first hammer fell with a dull thunk, splintering the frame of a loom. More blows followed, rhythmic and purposeful, the sound of wood and iron giving way under human fury. Cogs were pried loose, belts slashed, shuttles wrenched from their tracks. A lantern tipped over, spilling oil onto the floor, and within moments the air was thick with the smell of scorched wood. By the time the watchmen arrived, the Luddites had vanished into the hills, leaving behind a ruin of twisted iron and splintered timber. Word of the attack spread quickly, and in the weeks that followed, similar raids struck mills from Nottingham to Lancashire. But the government struck back harder. Parliament passed the Frame-Breaking Act, making machine smashing a capital crime. Soldiers were stationed at vulnerable mills, and suspected Luddites were hunted down. Some were hanged, others were transported to penal colonies in Australia. Still, for a brief season, the frame breakers had made their point. The machines might belong to the masters, but the night and the will to fight belonged to the workers. The Inferno at Mill Street, the Leeds factory fire of 1818. The morning of February 20th, 1818, began like any other at the flax mill on Mill Street in Leeds. Frost rimmed the windows, and the smell of coal smoke drifted through the narrow lanes. Inside the factory, the air was already warm from the great steam engine in the basement, its pistons thudding steadily, driving the rows of flax spinning frames above. The mill employed over 200 people, most of them women and children. Among them was 14-year-old Joseph Turner, who worked as a piecer, darting between frames to repair broken threads. His older sister, Anne, worked at the carding machine, feeding raw flax through spiked rollers that combed the fibers smooth. At 8:30, a shout rose from the third floor. A loose belt on one of the machines had slipped, striking a gas lamp. The flame caught a wisp of stray flax fiber in the air, and in seconds, the fire raced along the oily lint clinging to beams, walls, and rafters. The dry winter air made the fibers burn like tinder. Panic swept the building. The wooden stairs, the only way down from the upper floors, were already filling with black smoke. Workers crowded the windows, gasping for air, some screaming for ladders. But the fire spread faster than anyone could react. The machinery, cast iron and wood, became red-hot, warping and collapsing. On the ground floor, Joseph fought his way to the main doors, dragging a younger boy by the arm. He could hear the roof above groaning under the heat. Anne was nowhere in sight. The air was so thick with smoke that every breath felt like swallowing fire. Outside, townsfolk rushed with buckets, but the mill's height and the lack of proper firefighting equipment doomed the effort. Within an hour, the roof caved in with a deafening crash, sending a pillar of flame and embers into the winter sky. When the ashes cooled, 34 workers were dead, most of them trapped on the upper floors. Ann Turner was among them. The disaster shocked Leeds, and for a brief moment, mill owners faced public fury over the lack of fire escapes and safety measures. But the Industrial Revolution moved fast, and within weeks, another factory was already rising where the ashes lay. Still, the Mill Street fire left a shadow. Surviving workers told of dreams filled with smoke and heat, of hearing the cries of those trapped above. And Joseph, now an orphan in all but name, never again stepped foot inside a mill. The canal that changed America, the opening of the Erie, 1825. The morning of October 26, 1825, dawned clear over Albany, New York. Along the banks of the Hudson River, crowds gathered shoulder to shoulder, their breath puffing in the chill air. They had come to see something that many, only a decade earlier, had called impossible: the ceremonial opening of the Erie Canal, a 363-mile ribbon of water carved through wilderness and farmland, linking the Great Lakes to the Atlantic. At the head of the procession stood Governor DeWitt Clinton, dressed in a dark coat and tall hat, his eyes sweeping the flotilla of decorated boats. Behind him, flags from every state fluttered in the breeze. Clinton had been mocked as DeWitt's Ditch when the project began in 1817. Now the canal was finished, dug by hand through rock and swamp by thousands of laborers, many of them Irish immigrants who had braved malaria, frostbite, and backbreaking work. One of those men, Patrick O'Malley, stood on the towpath that morning, watching the first boats set off. He remembered the summers spent knee-deep in mud, swinging a pickaxe beside men who coughed blood from the damp. The canal had cost some their health, others their lives, but Patrick couldn't help feeling pride as he saw the waterway teeming with life. The lead boat, the Seneca Chief, carried kegs of fresh water from Lake Erie. The plan was to pour them into New York Harbor in a wedding of the waters, symbolically joining the inland lakes to the ocean. As the boat moved eastward, towns along the canal erupted in celebration, bands played, cannons fired, church bells rang. Farmers, merchants, and factory owners knew what this meant. Goods could now move from the frontier to the coast in days instead of weeks, at a fraction of the cost. For the new industrial towns along the route, places like Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo, the canal was a lifeline. Grain, lumber, iron, and manufactured goods flowed in both directions. The boom fed mills, workshops, and foundries, each powered by water wheels or, increasingly, by steam. Factories rose along the towpaths, and the hum of machinery began to mingle with the creak of barges and the clip-clop of mules hauling them. By the time the Seneca Chief reached New York City, the canal had already begun to reshape the American economy. Cities that had been sleepy outposts became industrial centers, trade routes shifted, fortunes were made. And for Patrick O'Malley, watching from the crowd as the waters of Lake Erie spilled into the Atlantic, it was more than a triumph of engineering. It was proof that the age of industry had come to America. The Rocket's Run, Stephenson and the Birth of the Railway Age, 1829. The morning air in Rainhill, Lancashire, was electric with anticipation. September 6, 1829, marked the Rainhill Trials, a contest that would determine which locomotive would haul passengers and freight along the new Liverpool and Manchester Railway. Steam engines had existed for decades, but no one had yet built one fast, reliable, and safe enough for regular travel. George Stephenson, the father of railways, stood beside his creation, the Rocket, checking valves and tightening bolts. Its polished boiler gleamed in the sunlight, the brass fittings reflecting the crowd gathered along the track. Children perched on fence posts, merchants and engineers murmured predictions, and rival inventors eyed Stephenson with suspicion. 12 miles of straight track lay ahead. Each locomotive would run in turn, judged on speed, reliability, and fuel efficiency. Stephenson could feel the hum of expectation through the wooden beams of the track. Years of tinkering, of trial and error in coal pits and workshops, had led to this moment. He ran a hand over the polished steel, feeling the heat and energy coiled inside. At last, the whistle blew and the Rocket lunged forward. Its wheels hissed and roared over the rails, each piston stroke sending a vibration up Stephenson's arm. Smoke curled into the sky, mingling with the cheers of the crowd. At 24 miles per hour, a speed unheard of for public transport, the engine crossed the finish line well ahead of its competitors. Among the onlookers was Elizabeth Hodgson, a local seamstress, who had never imagined leaving Manchester for Liverpool in a single morning. As the rocket passed, she could see her reflection in the polished side of the boiler, a hint of wonder in her eyes. For ordinary people, the steam locomotive was magic made real, a promise that distance could shrink, that towns could connect, and that travel could be both fast and regular. The Rainhill trials weren't just a contest of engines, they were a turning point. Within a decade, railway lines crisscrossed Britain, bringing raw materials to factories and finished goods to markets, moving people faster than ever before. The rockets symbolized the spirit of the Industrial Revolution, ingenuity, daring, and the relentless pursuit of progress. Stephenson watched the crowds disperse, the engine's warm boiler cooling in the autumn air. He knew that the world would never be the same. The age of steam had truly arrived. Child labor in the coal pits. Life in Staffordshire, 1830. The morning sky over Staffordshire was gray and heavy, as if even the heavens mourned the toil of those who labored below. At 5:30, 12-year-old William Harper clambered down the narrow shaft of a coal pit near the village of Biddulph. His lantern flickered against the wet stone walls, illuminating the slick rails along which tubs of coal would be hauled. William had begun working at the pit when he was only 9, following in the footsteps of his father, who had been in the mine since boyhood. His small frame made him perfect for crawling into the low tunnels, attaching chains, and guiding the heavy carts through twisting passageways. He worked from dawn until dusk, his hands blackened by coal dust, his lungs coated in the fine particles that made every breath a labor in itself. The pit was alive with sound, the clanging of metal, the shouts of haulage boys, the constant creak of wooden supports under immense weight. A misstep could crush him. A sudden collapse could trap him forever in the cold, damp darkness. Yet there was little time to think of fear. The work was relentless, and overseers demanded speed above all else. At midday, William sat on a damp rock and ate a piece of bread and some cold tea. Around him, other boys and girls his age rested briefly, their faces smeared with coal dust. Many were orphans or children of laboring families. Work in the mines was the only way to eat and keep a roof over their heads. A few older boys whispered about reformers in London, about new laws that might one day protect children like them. But these were faint hopes, barely audible over the roar of the mine. As the day wore on, the air grew heavier, the tunnels darker. William's small lamp cast shadows that danced across the walls like ghostly specters. He crawled, pulled, and pushed until his back ached and his knees were raw. When he finally emerged at sunset, the sky was a dull, smoky red, and his body felt years older than 12. The Industrial Revolution promised wealth and progress for Britain, but for boys like William, it brought exhaustion, danger, and the slow theft of childhood. Yet even amid the darkness, William dreamed. He dreamed of daylight above the hills, of a time when coal pits would be safer, and of a world where children could run free rather than crawl through stone tunnels. The Cotton Famine and the Irish Looms, 1839. The docks of Belfast were shrouded in mist that March morning. Ships creaked against the piers, loaded with bales of cotton from the Americas, while cranes swung silently above, waiting to offload their precious cargo. But today, the warehouses stood half empty, and for the thousands of weavers in Ulster, that meant hunger. 17-year-old Margaret O'Donnell sat at her loom in a cramped cottage, the wooden beams rattling as she worked. Her fingers moved mechanically, pulling thread and weaving fabric that no one would buy, for the mills in Lancashire, which had once guaranteed steady trade, were running dry. A blight in the American South had destroyed a large portion of the cotton crop, and factories across England had slowed or shut down completely. Margaret's father, a former mill worker who had returned to the countryside after losing his job in Manchester, paced the small room. "If the mills don't get cotton soon, there won't be enough for bread," he said, voice tight with worry. Outside, neighbors huddled together, sharing what little they had. Some sold chickens, others bartered old tools, but most families faced weeks of empty tables. The crisis was global. Factory owners in Manchester and Liverpool struggled to pay workers, while Irish weavers, long dependent on imported cotton, were trapped in a cycle of debt and scarcity. Relief efforts were slow. Parish officials distributed flour and potatoes, but many families survived on meager rations, often going days without a proper meal. One evening, Margaret walked to the small stream behind her cottage. Hopping the cold water would ease the aches in her hands from constant weaving. She thought of the great mills she had never seen in England, of the workers who toiled there, and of how a sickness in a foreign land could reach across the ocean and starve her family. The Industrial Revolution had promised prosperity, but it also showed how fragile that promise could be. By summer, shipments resumed and mills began turning again. Yet the memory of empty looms lingered, a reminder that industrial progress brought both opportunity and vulnerability, and that even the hum of machinery could not shield people from the caprices of the world. The steam-powered loom, Cartwright and the mechanization of textile work, 1785. The workshop was filled with the smell of hot iron and the tang of wet wood, a place where invention met the grind of reality. Edmund Cartwright, tall and stooped with concentration, wiped sweat from his brow as he inspected the contraption in front of him. It was a loom, yes, but not one that needed the constant pull of human hands. Instead, a small steam engine, roaring in the corner, powered the weaving of cloth automatically. Cartwright had envisioned this machine for years. Textile production in England was booming, but manual looms were slow, prone to error, and dependent on skilled labor. He believed that mechanization could change everything, make cloth cheaper, faster, and in quantities unimaginable. Yet for many weavers, the news was terrifying. They saw machines as threats, capable of replacing years of skill with unfeeling iron. In the workshop, Cartwright's assistants fed thread through the machine, adjusting tension and guiding the shuttle. The loom moved with a relentless, precise rhythm, weaving patterns in a fraction of the time it would take a human worker. Cartwright's eyes gleamed. "This is only the beginning," he murmured. "Soon, mills will fill with engines like this. Britain will clothe the world." Outside the workshop, reactions were mixed. Local weavers muttered in taverns about iron devils stealing their bread. Factory owners, however, saw opportunity. Investors began pouring money into mills that could house dozens of these machines, and by the early 19th century, powered looms spread across the country. Cotton production soared, prices dropped, and clothing became more accessible to ordinary people. Yet progress came at a cost. Skilled handweavers found themselves unemployed, their homes and lives disrupted. Cartwright himself noted the social friction, though he insisted the benefits outweighed the pain. In towns like Nottingham, riots occasionally erupted as desperate workers attacked the new looms, echoing the fears of the Luddites a few decades later. By the time the steam-powered loom became widespread, Britain's textile industry was transformed forever. Machines hummed day and night, feeding the world with cloth. And in a small workshop in Derbyshire, the shadow of Cartwright's engine still lingered, a testament to human ingenuity, and a reminder that every invention carries both promise and peril. The Great Stink and Urban Reform, London, 1858. The Thames had always been London's lifeline, but in the summer of 1858, it became a symbol of disaster. The city sweltered under an unrelenting heat wave, and the river, swollen with sewage and industrial waste, emitted a stench so unbearable that it seeped into homes, offices, and even the halls of Parliament. Edward Harris, a young clerk living near Southwark, struggled to keep the smell out of his apartment. Windows were propped open, but the stench invaded relentlessly, clinging to curtains, clothes, and hair. On the streets, Citizens coughed and gagged, vendors waved fans futilely, and public officials wrinkled their noses as they debated what to do. The problem had been building for decades. London's population had exploded from the Industrial Revolution, swelling from roughly 1 million in 1800 to over 2.5 million by the 1850s. Housing was crowded, factories churned out smoke and waste, and the river, long used as an open sewer, could no longer cope. Cholera outbreaks had already claimed thousands, and now the great stink seemed to threaten the very heart of government. On July 16th, the stench reached the Palace of Westminster. MPs complained of nausea and fainted in the House of Commons, forcing windows open and hastening the urgent planning of a sanitation overhaul. Engineers, led by Joseph Bazalgette, surveyed the city and devised a network of sewers and pumping stations designed to carry waste safely away from the Thames. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens bore the brunt. Families like the Harrises built small filth pits outside their homes, boiled water before drinking, and avoided the river entirely. Street children scavenged among the refuse, risking disease daily. The smell of decomposition and coal smoke became a constant companion, a reminder of the human cost of rapid industrial growth. By the end of the summer, Parliament approved Bazalgette's ambitious plan. Construction would take years, but it laid the foundation for modern urban sanitation. London's rivers would eventually run cleaner, and outbreaks of cholera would decrease dramatically. For Edward Harris, the Great Stink was more than a foul summer. It was proof that industrial progress demanded responsibility, and that unchecked growth could threaten life itself. The Factory Acts and the Fight for Workers' Rights, 1833. The air inside the textile mill of Oldham was thick with lint and heat. Children as young as 8 labored at spinning machines, their fingers raw, their lungs coated with cotton dust. 12-year-old Samuel Hughes wiped sweat from his brow as the overseer's cane tapped across the floor, urging him to move faster. The machines never slept, and neither did the demands of the mill. But in 1833, a new hope flickered in Parliament. The Factory Act, passed that year, promised change. Children under 9 were forbidden to work, and those aged 9 to 13 could work only 8 hours a day. While it was a small step, reformers like Michael Sadler and Lord Ashley had fought tirelessly to bring the issue of child labor into the public eye. Samuel's father, a former weaver, read the newspaper aloud one morning, voice trembling with disbelief. "They say Parliament wants to protect children," he said. "Perhaps Samuel will not have to work from sunrise to sunset." Samuel felt a mixture of excitement and fear. Would the law really be enforced? Would the overseers listen? Inspectors soon arrived, walking the crowded mill floors and noting the ages of the young workers. In some towns, mill owners resisted, hiding children's true ages or stretching the rules to maintain productivity. Yet in Oldham, the act began to take hold. Samuel was allowed a break for schooling, learning reading and arithmetic in the same cramped room where cotton still clattered around him. The Factory Acts of 1833 were not perfect, but they marked a turning point in industrial Britain. The relentless grind of child labor had been acknowledged as a social problem, and the government had intervened for the first time in the private domain of the factory. Families felt a cautious optimism, though the struggle continued. Enforcement was uneven, and exploitation persisted. For Samuel, those early mornings in the mill became slightly less punishing, the endless noise slightly less terrifying. He carried a notebook in his pocket, scribbling letters and sums during breaks, imagining a future where knowledge might carry him beyond the walls of the mill. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping Britain in countless ways, and now, finally, it was starting to recognize the human cost of its engines and looms. The telegraph and the first instant communication, 1837. The workshop in London hummed with quiet excitement. Wires, batteries, and copper plates were scattered across tables, while Samuel Morse, an American inventor visiting Europe, bent over a strange contraption that would soon change the world. It was a telegraph, a device capable of sending messages across miles in seconds, using pulses of electricity to represent letters and numbers. In the early 1830s, sending a message meant days, sometimes weeks, for a letter to arrive. News of a railway accident, a cotton shipment delayed, or a political decision could take forever to reach the people who needed it most. Morse envisioned a system where communication could travel at the speed of light, bridging cities, countries, even continents. In a demonstration at the London Institute, Morse sent a simple message to a receiving station across the city. A patient mind can achieve wonders. The telegraph's click-click-click echoed across the room as the paper tape unrolled at the other end, confirming the transmission. Engineers gasped. Merchants leaned forward with wide eyes. It seemed like magic, yet it was pure science. Back in New York, news of the telegraph's success traveled quickly by ship and letter, inspiring American investors and government officials. Within a few years, telegraph lines would stretch along railways and canals, connecting factories to ports, merchants to markets, and families to distant relatives. Orders could be placed instantly, shipments coordinated with precision, disasters warned against before they occurred. For workers in mills and offices, the telegraph meant an acceleration of the industrial pace. Decisions that once required weeks now took hours, and the world felt suddenly smaller, faster, more interconnected. Morse's invention wasn't a loom, a steam engine, or a factory floor, yet it was as powerful as any machine, transforming commerce, governance, and daily life. And in that small London workshop, as Morse watched the paper tape spool and the message complete its journey, he realized that the Industrial Revolution was entering a new phase, one not only of production and movement, but of information, instant and unstoppable. The Rise of Steel, Bessemer and the Transformation of Industry, 1856. The clang of iron rang through Henry Bessemer's workshop in Sheffield, echoing off brick walls thick with soot. It was 1856, and Bessemer had spent years perfecting a method to turn pig iron into steel on an industrial scale. The problem, he realized, was not just melting metal but removing impurities efficiently, quickly, and reliably. Bessemer's breakthrough came with the introduction of a blast of air into molten iron. The oxygen burned away carbon and other impurities, and the result was steel stronger, lighter, and more versatile than anything previously available. He poured his first successful batch into molds, holding his breath as the glowing metal cooled. The steel was perfect, uniform, resilient, and cheap enough to revolutionize industry. In the years that followed, Bessemer steel transformed Britain's landscape. Railways expanded with stronger tracks, bridges soared across rivers, factory buildings rose taller than ever. Shipbuilders embraced the metal for hulls, making vessels faster and more durable. Engineers could dream bigger, building machinery and tools that had once been impossible. Yet the revolution wasn't only technological. Laborers found new work in steel mills, though the work was dangerous and exhausting. Children and adults alike labored near furnaces that reached unimaginable heat, the air thick with smoke and sparks. Accidents were common, and unions had not yet gained the influence to demand protections. Still, the impact of Bessemer's innovation was undeniable. Cities like Sheffield, Pittsburgh, and Newcastle became steel capitals, drawing workers, investors, and inventors from around the world. The very skeleton of industrial society, railways, ships, bridges, and machines, depended on this new metal. Bessemer himself walked among the furnaces, wiping sweat from his brow, knowing that he had given the Industrial Revolution a backbone, both literally and figuratively. His steel was more than a material. It was a symbol of human ingenuity, transforming industry, commerce, and the very shape of civilization. The Great Exhibition, London, 1851. The air in Hyde Park buzzed with excitement on May 1st, 1851. Tens of thousands of people, dressed in top hats, bonnets, and polished boots, streamed toward the Crystal Palace, the magnificent glass and iron structure built to house the world's first industrial fair. The Great Exhibition was a showcase of human ingenuity, engineering marvels, and the fruits of the Industrial Revolution. Inside, the vast hall glittered with machinery, textiles, and inventions from every corner of the globe. Steam engines hissed and churned, demonstrating power that once belonged only to rivers and waterfalls. Looms wove intricate patterns at breathtaking speed. Telegraphs transmitted messages across the hall, while models of railways and bridges displayed the possibilities of metal and mechanics. Among the visitors was 12-year-old Thomas Whitfield, an apprentice machinist from Birmingham. His eyes widened as he watched a hydraulic press lift tons of iron effortlessly. "It's like magic," he whispered to his companion. The exhibition wasn't just entertainment. It was a lesson in what human labor, combined with steam and steel, could achieve. Queen Victoria herself toured the exhibition, flanked by ministers and dignitaries, symbolizing Britain's dominance in industry. Inventors from France, Germany, the United States, and India mingled with British engineers, exchanging ideas and marveling at each other's creations. For the first time, industrial progress was celebrated on a global stage, not just as a national achievement but as a human triumph. The exhibition also exposed the world to stark contrasts. While some marveled at luxury goods and fine craftsmanship, others could not ignore the evidence of exploitation: child laborers operating machines, the harsh conditions in factories, and the vast divide between wealth and poverty. For many, it was a bittersweet glimpse of the Industrial Revolution's power and its cost. When the exhibition closed in October, the Crystal Palace would be moved and rebuilt, but the memory of that spectacle lingered. Visitors carried home new ideas, inspiration, and ambition. The Great Exhibition was more than a display. It was a declaration. The Industrial Revolution had reshaped the world, and its influence would only continue to grow. The miners' strike of 1842, voices in the coal pits. The mines of Yorkshire were dark long before dawn. Smoke from distant furnaces hung over the hills, mixing with the morning mist. Inside, men and boys descended into narrow shafts, their lanterns casting eerie shadows on the damp walls. Among them was 16-year-old Joseph Craven, whose father had worked the same pits for decades. Today, Joseph felt a mixture of fear and determination. He was about to take part in a strike that would shake the region. The Great Strike of 1842 had begun after coal owners refused to reduce working hours or improve pay, despite grueling labor and dangerous conditions. Men, women, and even children had suffered accidents, collapses, and illnesses from years underground. Joseph and hundreds of others gathered in the village square, voices low at first, then rising in a chant that echoed across the valleys. For weeks, the miners refused to descend into the pits. Families went hungry, relying on neighbors and church charity to survive. Yet the strike was not just about wages. It was about dignity and safety. Joseph recalled the collapse last winter that had killed 3 of his friends, trapped beneath tons of rock while owners looked the other way. Now, united, the workers demanded recognition. Authorities responded with soldiers and warnings. Meetings were disrupted, leaders arrested, and tensions escalated. One evening, Joseph and fellow miners gathered by the river, whispering plans and fears. "We're not just fighting for coal," he said. "We're fighting so our children won't suffer as we have." After several weeks, the strike ended with mixed results. Some concessions were made, small reductions in hours and slightly better pay, but many miners returned to the pits knowing that their work was still dangerous and poorly compensated. Yet the strike left a mark on the labor movement. It showed that even ordinary workers, armed with solidarity, could challenge the might of industrial power. For Joseph, the experience was both exhausting and empowering. The Industrial Revolution promised progress, wealth, and machines that transformed society, but it also demanded courage from those who labored in darkness, often invisible, beneath the engines and furnaces that powered the modern world. The Steamship Revolution. Brunel's Great Western, 1838. The docks of Bristol were alive with activity on July 19, 1838. Crowds gathered to witness the launch of the Great Western, the brainchild of the young engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Unlike any ship before it, the vessel was powered not by wind but by a massive steam engine, promising speed, reliability, and a new era of transatlantic travel. On board, the crew tested the pistons and paddle wheels, while Brunel paced the deck, checking every detail. He knew skeptics watched him closely. Many believed that a steamship could never safely cross the Atlantic. Yet the Great Western was built with iron-reinforced timbers, a hull designed for the Atlantic's rough waves, and a precision-engineered engine that could keep it moving regardless of wind or tide. Among the passengers was Margaret Sinclair, traveling to visit family in New York. She marveled at the sight of the paddle wheels churning the water and the rhythmic hiss of steam escaping the boilers. "It feels like flying on the water," she whispered to her companion. For travelers and merchants alike, the steamship promised speed, predictability, and a shrinking world where oceans no longer meant weeks of uncertainty. The journey itself was revolutionary. The Great Western crossed the Atlantic in just 15 days, nearly half the time of traditional sailing vessels. Cargo moved faster, mail reached distant continents reliably, and the notion of international trade was forever altered. Ports adapted, warehouses expanded, and entire industries, from shipbuilding to coal mining, boomed to meet the demands of steam-powered commerce. Yet with innovation came risk. Boiler explosions, mechanical failures, and storms remained constant threats. Sailors and engineers worked under intense pressure, their lives intertwined with the relentless pulse of machinery. Brunel himself famously risked his life inspecting engines mid-voyage, driven by the conviction that technology could transform society. The launch of the Great Western marked more than a single achievement. It heralded the age of steam. Across oceans, rivers, and ports, humanity discovered that distance and time could be conquered. The Industrial Revolution had leaped from land to sea, reshaping trade, travel, and the very rhythm of daily life for millions. The rise of the middle class, factories and social change, 1840s. The streets of Manchester in the 1840s were a study in contrasts. Thick smoke from factory chimneys hung over brick terraces, while elegant carriages clattered past newly paved avenues. Among the throngs of workers, a new social group was emerging, the industrial middle class. They were factory owners, merchants, engineers, and professionals whose wealth was tied not to land, but to machines, trade, and enterprise. Eleanor Price, the daughter of a textile manufacturer, walked briskly along Deansgate one morning, notebook in hand. Her father had risen from humble beginnings to own 3 mills, employing hundreds. Eleanor saw the world differently from the weavers who passed her in the street, coal dust clinging to their hair and clothes. She attended salons and lectures, read newspapers on politics and economics, and imagined a society where merit and ambition, rather than birth, determined opportunity. The rise of the middle class brought both influence and tension. They built schools, libraries, and hospitals, investing in public welfare and education, but they also maintained rigid social hierarchies. Factory managers demanded discipline, order, and punctuality from workers while enjoying leisure, travel, and fine goods. Their homes were heated with coal, furnished with polished mahogany, and decorated with imported textiles, symbols of success born from industrial enterprise. For the working class, the growing wealth above often felt distant. Wages remained low, hours long, and living conditions cramped. Yet some mobility was possible. A skilled artisan or clerk might rise, perhaps to a supervisory role in a mill or shop. Education and apprenticeship became avenues for hope, though the gap between the chimneyed skyline and the drawing room ceilings remained stark. In towns like Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds, the middle class shaped the pace of industrial change. They invested in railways, factories, and steamships. They funded scientific experiments and technological innovations. They organized societies to debate politics, economics, and morality. The Industrial Revolution was not just a transformation of machines, but a remaking of society itself, producing new ambitions, opportunities, and divisions. Eleanor often paused by the mill gates to watch the workers file in and out, contemplating the invisible threads connecting them to her family's wealth. The machines roared, the streets bustled, and the middle class, newly confident, began to define what modern Britain would look like: prosperous, industrious, and forever changed. The telegraph bridges continents, the transatlantic cable, 1858. The waves of the Atlantic shimmered under a gray morning sky as the SS Niagara and the HMS Agamemnon sailed side by side, carrying the hopes of nations. On board lay the world's first attempt at a transatlantic telegraph cable, a slender, insulated wire designed to carry pulses of electricity beneath the ocean. For decades, the dream of instant communication between Europe and America had seemed impossible, until now. Charles Bright, chief engineer of the project, stood at the bow, scanning the horizon. Each mile of cable laid across the seabed was a gamble. The Atlantic's currents, storms, and immense pressure threatened to sever the connection. Yet after months of painstaking work, the cable was ready. Bright and his team carefully monitored the machinery, ensuring the delicate insulation would survive the plunge into deep waters. On August 16, 1858, the first message was sent from Queen Victoria to President James Buchanan. "Glory to God in the highest, on earth peace, goodwill toward men." The signal, transmitted in Morse code, arrived in Washington within minutes, a feat that would have taken weeks by ship. Newspapers reported the achievement as nothing short of miraculous, and celebrations erupted in both continents. The transatlantic cable revolutionized trade, diplomacy, and news. Merchants could confirm orders, financiers could monitor markets, and governments could communicate with unprecedented speed. For ordinary citizens, news of family or events across the ocean traveled almost instantly, shrinking the vast Atlantic to the span of a single cable. Yet the endeavor was not without challenges. The first cable failed after just 3 weeks, requiring new engineering solutions and stronger materials. Still, engineers pressed on, determined to connect the world. Ships carried heavier cables, better insulation, and more powerful transmission devices. Each successful message reinforced the promise of a connected global society. The transatlantic telegraph symbolized more than technology. It represented human ambition, ingenuity, and the drive to overcome natural limits. As Charles Bright watched the signal pulses flicker across the ocean floor, he understood that industry was no longer confined to factories and railways. It now spanned continents, uniting the world in ways previously unimaginable. The rise of urban rail, the London Underground, 1863. The streets of London in the early 1860s were a maze of horse-drawn carriages, pedestrians, and carts hauling goods to and from the bustling docks. Crowds pushed through narrow roads, smoke from coal fires and factories thick in the air. Above ground, congestion had become unbearable. Below, an audacious plan was unfolding: a railway beneath the city, a subterranean artery to carry passengers swiftly and safely through the crowded metropolis. Charles Pearson, the visionary lawyer and reformer behind the project, walked along the partially constructed tunnels, lantern in hand. The engineers and workers had carved deep trenches through clay and rock, bracing them with brick arches. Steam locomotives would soon rumble beneath the streets, moving commuters away from the suffocating smoke above. On January 10, 1863, the Metropolitan Railway opened between Paddington and Farringdon, the first section of what would become the London Underground. Passengers, mostly clerks, tradesmen, and middle-class families, marveled at the novelty. Carriages were lit with gas lamps, the hum of the engine echoing in the brick-lined tunnels. For many, the underground ride was a revelation, 15 minutes that had once taken an hour above ground. The project transformed urban life. Factories and offices could draw workers from greater distances, expanding the city's workforce. Shops flourished near stations, and new neighborhoods emerged along the line. Engineers developed solutions to challenges that had seemed insurmountable: ventilation shafts to clear smoke, water pumps to combat flooding, and reinforced tunnels to support the streets above. Yet the underground was also a symbol of industrial risks. Accidents occurred, smoke choked passengers, and construction claimed lives. Still, Londoners embraced the innovation, recognizing that the Industrial Revolution was not only about factories, mines, and machines. It was also about reshaping daily life, solving problems, and moving masses of people efficiently. As Pearson looked down the brick-lined tunnel, he imagined a network crisscrossing the city, linking districts that had once felt distant. The underground promised speed, connectivity, and growth, a testament to human ingenuity and the determination to bend even the earth beneath London to the needs of modern industry. The Luddite riots, resistance to machines, 1811–1816. The darkened cottages of Nottinghamshire were tense with whispers and fear. By 1811, the Industrial Revolution had begun to reshape the textile industry, replacing skilled artisans with mechanized looms that could produce fabric faster and cheaper than human hands. For many workers, this meant unemployment, poverty, and desperation. Among them was young weaver Thomas Hargreaves, who had learned his craft from his father, who had learned from his father before him. Rumors of machine breaking spread through villages like wildfire. At night, groups of workers, calling themselves Luddites, would gather in secret. Their mission was clear: destroy the machines that threatened their livelihoods. Armed with sledgehammers, clubs, and courage born of desperation, they attacked factories, smashing looms and shutters, leaving symbolic graffiti warning owners of further action. One January night, Thomas joined a small group outside a mill. Hearts pounded, lanterns flickered, and snow fell silently around them. The first strike of the hammer shattered the loom's gears. A cheer rose, quickly muffled by the sound of guards approaching. Panic spread as the Luddites scattered into the darkness, leaving behind the wreckage of machinery and a trail of fear. The government responded harshly. Soldiers patrolled the countryside, and new laws made machine breaking a capital offense. Several Luddites were hanged, while others fled to the hills. Yet the riots continued sporadically for years, a testament to the anger, fear, and hopelessness of skilled workers watching their trades vanish before their eyes. Historians would later see the Luddite movement not as mere sabotage, but as a symbol of resistance to the social and economic upheavals brought by industrialization. Families like Thomas's lived on the edge of survival, caught between the promise of progress and the reality of displacement. Machines hummed in factories, but the human cost echoed in empty homes, broken traditions, and silent workshops. Thomas returned home one cold dawn, hands raw and clothes torn, realizing the Industrial Revolution would not wait for sentiment, skill, or history. The age of machinery had arrived, and those unwilling or unable to adapt faced a harsh, unyielding world, a world that demanded new forms of labor, ingenuity, and resilience. The Cotton Mills of Lowell, Factory Life for Women, 1823. The morning bell rang sharply across the sprawling Lowell mills, calling hundreds of young women to their workstations. Among them was 16-year-old Abigail Turner, who had left her family farm in New Hampshire for the promise of steady wages and independence. The mills were a marvel: long brick buildings, spinning mules clattering endlessly, and rows of looms stretching as far as the eye could see. Abigail's day began at dawn. She fed the threads into the machines, monitored the spinning wheels, and corrected snags before the overseer noticed. The air was thick with lint, dust, and the rhythmic roar of machinery, which seemed to vibrate through her bones. Breaks were short. Meals often consisted of bread and cheese eaten at a corner table. Yet Abigail valued her independence, sending part of her wages home and using the rest for books, lessons, and small luxuries forbidden on the family farm. The Lowell mills were also centers of community and culture. Workers attended lectures, wrote essays, and organized reading circles, fostering intellectual growth alongside industrial labor. Abigail's friend, Mary Sullivan, spoke passionately about women's education and labor rights, dreams that mingled with the hum of the looms. For many, the mills were both a workplace and a classroom, a place where opportunity and exploitation coexisted. Still, life in the mills was exhausting. Accidents were common, fingers caught in wheels, bodies crushed under shifting machinery. Lint and dust caused chronic coughs and respiratory illnesses. Long hours eroded youth and health, and wages, while better than farm labor, were barely enough to live comfortably. Yet the women endured, driven by necessity, ambition, and a desire to claim a place in the emerging industrial world. By evening, Abigail walked home along the canal, soot staining her sleeves, but a sense of pride in her step. She had earned her independence, contributed to her family's survival, and participated in a transformation sweeping across America. The cotton mills of Lowell were more than factories. They were engines of social change, shaping the lives of women who would become pioneers of labor, education, and reform in the industrial age. The steam hammer, Nasmyth and the power to shape metal, 1839. The foundry roared with heat and the smell of molten iron. James Nasmyth, a young Scottish engineer, stood beside a towering contraption, his eyes fixed on the massive hammer suspended above the glowing metal. It was 1839, and Nasmyth had just perfected the steam hammer, a machine capable of delivering blows far more powerful and precise than any human could muster. Previously, shaping large pieces of iron required teams of laborers swinging sledgehammers in unison, slow, dangerous work that limited what engineers could achieve. Nasmyth's invention transformed the process. Steam pressure controlled the hammer, allowing it to lift, strike, and shape enormous blocks of iron with a rhythm both powerful and delicate. Bridges, ships, locomotives, and machinery could now be built on a scale previously unimaginable. In the workshop, apprentices scrambled to feed the iron beneath the hammer, their ears ringing with each colossal strike. Sparks flew, and the floor shook, but the precision of the steam hammer was undeniable. A single press could mold a massive girder for a bridge, something that once would have taken days of coordinated human labor. Nasmyth watched the metal deform under the hammer's blows, thinking of the ships that would sail, the locomotives that would race, and the bridges that would span rivers thanks to this new power. The steam hammer also symbolized a shift in industrial labor. Human strength was no longer the limiting factor. Machines amplified skill and allowed engineers to tackle grander designs. Yet workers still faced risks. Molten metal, heavy machinery, and steam pressure demanded constant vigilance. Apprentices learned quickly that one mistake could mean injury or worse. Within a decade, the steam hammer became indispensable in factories and foundries across Europe and America. Nasmyth's invention helped usher in a new era of industrial architecture and engineering, shaping the very framework of modern cities. It was more than a tool. It was a testament to ingenuity, showing that machines could magnify human ambition and reshape the material world. The rise of factory towns, Manchester and the engine of industry, 1840s. The skyline of Manchester in the 1840s was dominated by brick chimneys, belching smoke that darkened the morning sun. Streets were narrow, crowded, and bustling with carts, pedestrians, and street vendors. At the center of it all, factories hummed endlessly, the rhythmic clatter of looms, gears, and steam engines creating a soundtrack of relentless productivity. Among the new residents was Samuel Green, a young weaver who had arrived from a rural village seeking work. The factory town promised employment, opportunity, and a chance to escape the hardships of farm life. Yet the reality was stark. Rows of cramped tenements, narrow alleys clogged with waste, and the constant din of machinery. Every breath was tinged with coal smoke and textile dust. Manchester's factory system reshaped society. Entire communities revolved around industrial schedules. Men, women, and children labored long hours in mills. Local markets catered to workers' needs. Schools and churches appeared sporadically, often funded by philanthropic mill owners. Social hierarchies were visible. The wealthy industrialists lived in spacious homes, while laborers crowded into multi-family dwellings, struggling to survive. Samuel's days were long. From dawn to dusk, he tended the looms, repairing broken threads and keeping pace with the machine. The work was exhausting, yet it offered a wage he could send home to his family. Nights were brief and leisure rare. Still, Samuel took pride in his contribution to the city's growing reputation as the workshop of the world, where cotton, machinery, and enterprise converged in unstoppable motion. The rapid urban growth brought both innovation and challenges. Sanitation lagged behind population increases, disease spread quickly, and fires and accidents were common in tightly packed buildings. Yet the energy of the city was undeniable. Ideas, commerce, and technology intersected in Manchester, transforming not only the landscape but the very rhythm of daily life. For Samuel and thousands like him, factory towns represented the promise and peril of industrialization, opportunity intertwined with hardship, progress alongside danger. Manchester, a city born of industry, became a microcosm of the Industrial Revolution itself, a place where machines, labor, and ambition collided to create the modern urban world. The cotton famine in Lancashire, economic turmoil, 1861–1865. The factories of Lancashire, normally alive with the hum of spinning wheels and the rhythm of looms, were eerily silent in 1862. The American Civil War had cut off the supply of raw cotton, leaving mill owners desperate and workers unemployed. Among those affected was 19-year-old Thomas Riley, a weaver whose family had relied on the mills for generations. Each morning, Thomas walked past the silent factories, their gates chained and machines still. Families gathered in the streets, sharing scraps of news and meager rations. The disruption was widespread. Towns that had flourished on the back of textile production now faced poverty, hunger, and uncertainty. Some workers petitioned for relief, others turned to charity, while a few considered leaving Lancashire entirely in search of work. The cotton famine revealed the vulnerabilities of industrial dependence. Mills could not operate without raw materials, and global conflicts, half a world away, could bring prosperity to a halt. Owners struggled to maintain payrolls, yet profits had been made in better times. Workers, meanwhile, bore the brunt of the crisis, forced to ration food, take in boarders, or beg to survive. In addition to economic hardship, the famine fueled social tension. Strikes, protests, and petitions filled the towns, while charitable organizations and local parishes worked to distribute flour, potatoes, and coal. Thomas volunteered to help deliver supplies, finding purpose amid despair. He observed how the interconnectedness of the industrial world, cotton from America, mills in England, markets in Europe, could lift people up or leave them destitute in an instant. By 1865, the Civil War ended, and cotton shipments gradually resumed. Factories reopened, and workers returned to their stations, fingers raw from looms, lungs filled with dust once again. Yet the cotton famine left a lasting lesson. The Industrial Revolution was global, fragile, and deeply interdependent. For Thomas and his fellow workers, it underscored the precariousness of lives tied to machines and markets that span oceans. The telegraph in war. Crimean War communications, 1853–1856. The battlefields of the Crimean Peninsula were a chaotic clash of mud, smoke, and cannon fire. Armies struggled not only with the enemy but with the challenge of communication. Messages that once took days to reach headquarters now traveled almost instantly, thanks to the telegraph, a device whose pulses of electricity reshaped military strategy. Captain William Harris of the British Army watched as telegraph lines were strung along the front. Each pole, wire, and relay station was a lifeline. Orders, casualty reports, and supply requests flowed in Morse code across the peninsula, allowing commanders to respond more swiftly than ever before. Soldiers in trenches glanced at the telegraph poles as if they were as crucial as rifles or artillery. In London, government officials monitored the conflict with unprecedented immediacy. Updates arrived within hours, rather than the weeks required by horseback or ship. Newspapers could publish near real-time accounts, feeding the public's fascination and concern. Families of soldiers clutched each telegraph notice, their anxiety tempered by the knowledge that communication was no longer a distant hope. For engineers and operators like Thomas Langley, the work was grueling. Poles had to be erected across rough terrain, lines repaired under fire and in storms. Telegraph offices were crowded with operators tapping codes endlessly, the rhythmic clatter of Morse code mingling with distant cannon shots. Mistakes could cost lives. A single miscommunicated order might send troops into deadly positions. The telegraph changed the nature of war itself. Logistics, troop movements, and supply chains became more efficient. Coordination improved. Commanders could act with foresight rather than guesswork. Yet it also magnified the human cost. Faster orders meant faster attacks, and the speed of industrial communication carried the consequences of modern warfare directly to both soldiers and civilians. By the war's end, the Crimean campaign had demonstrated the telegraph's power. Military operations, diplomacy, and journalism had all been transformed. Captain Harris and his fellow soldiers recognized that the Industrial Revolution extended far beyond factories and cities. It now shaped strategy, command, and the very way nations conducted war. Coal dust and industrial health. Miners lives in the 19th century. The mines of South Wales were a labyrinth of tunnels, shafts, and darkness, where miners like 16-year-old Owen Morgan descended daily into the earth. The air was thick with coal dust, making every breath a struggle. Lanterns cast flickering shadows on walls blackened by soot, while the distant echo of pickaxes and carts reverberated endlessly. Coal powered the Industrial Revolution, fueling factories, locomotives, and steamships, yet the miners who extracted it paid the price. Owen's father had lost several fingers in a pit accident, and stories of roof collapses and explosions haunted every corridor. The air, laced with coal dust, caused chronic coughs, lung disease, and fatigue, yet miners pressed on, bound by necessity and family obligation. Accidents were relentless. Timber supports could fail without warning. Sudden gas pockets could ignite. Floods could trap men for hours or days. Despite the danger, miners developed a tight-knit camaraderie, relying on one another for survival. Owen learned quickly to listen for subtle changes in the air, to watch the behavior of men and mules, and to respect the precarious balance between life and death underground. Families endured hardship above ground as well. Wives and children worried constantly, preparing meals in small, smoky cottages while hopping the pit whistle would signal a safe return. Children often assisted with hauling coal, reinforcing the cycle of labor and exposure. Community support was essential. Charity, shared labor, and local traditions offered relief amid the relentless industrial demand. Coal mining was more than a job. It was a way of life shaped by risk, skill, and resilience. Owen understood that the Industrial Revolution depended on the sacrifices of men and boys like him, whose labor fueled factories, trains, and ships. Yet the human cost was immense, reminding all that progress, speed, and energy came at the expense of lives buried in the shadowed veins beneath the earth. The rise of public parks, urban reform and recreation, 1850s. The streets of Manchester and London in the 1850s were crowded, noisy, and filled with smoke from factories. Children played amid horse dung and soot, and families lived in cramped tenements with little access to fresh air. Amid this urban chaos, reformers began advocating for public parks, open spaces where city dwellers could breathe, play, and escape the relentless grind of industrial life. In 1857, Victoria Park in East London opened its gates to the public. 12-year-old Emily Carter ran across the freshly planted lawns, her shoes sinking into the soft grass. Families picnicked under newly planted trees, and musicians performed on temporary stages. For the first time, residents who had never known greenery within walking distance could experience sunlight, shade, and open space. The creation of parks was a deliberate social experiment. Reformers believed that access to nature could improve health, reduce crime, and instill moral discipline. Parks became classrooms for the urban poor, providing fresh air, exercise, and a chance to observe order, beauty, and hygiene, lessons in civic pride for young and old alike. Yet the parks were also contested spaces. Industrialists and landowners sometimes resisted giving up valuable land. The poorest residents still struggled to access the parks fully, and policing was often heavy-handed to enforce decorum. Still, the movement spread. By the 1860s, cities across Britain and Europe had begun investing in parks, promenades, and recreation grounds. For Emily, the park was a revelation. She could run freely, inhale clean air, and watch birds flit across trees instead of chimneys. Her father, a factory worker, appreciated the respite, even if brief, from the relentless pace of industry. Public parks became symbols of civic responsibility and the promise that urban life, though dominated by machines and labor, could also offer beauty, leisure, and human dignity. The rise of public parks demonstrated that the Industrial Revolution was not only about factories, railways, and steam engines. It was also about shaping human life within the urban environment. Cities were learning to accommodate the human spirit, even amid the relentless pulse of industrial progress. The Suez Canal, Industrial Ambition and Global Trade, 1869. The waters of the Isthmus of Suez shimmered under the scorching Egyptian sun as thousands of laborers dug tirelessly, supervised by engineers from Europe. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the French diplomat and visionary behind the Suez Canal, walked along the banks, observing progress on the 120-mile waterway that would link the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. It was 1869, and the canal promised to transform global trade, shrinking journeys between Europe and Asia by thousands of miles. Among the workers was Ahmed, a local laborer who had left his village for the opportunity to earn wages. Each day, he wielded shovels, moved earth, and loaded barges, sweat mingling with the dust of excavation. The work was grueling, the sun relentless, yet he marveled at the scale of the project. Steam-powered dredgers, pumps, and machinery reshaped the desert, making what had seemed impossible a reality. The canal's opening was a spectacle. Ships sailed directly from the Mediterranean into the Red Sea, avoiding the long, treacherous journey around Africa's Cape of Good Hope. Trade accelerated. Cotton, spices, textiles, and manufactured goods moved faster than ever, reducing costs and connecting markets across continents. Industrial powers like Britain and France strengthened their economic and political influence, while local populations experienced both opportunity and upheaval. Yet the Suez Canal also embodied the challenges of industrial ambition. Diseases like cholera and malaria plagued workers. Many lives were lost to exhaustion and infection. Engineering obstacles required innovation, including massive locks, dredging techniques, and irrigation systems. De Lesseps and his team faced setbacks, financial strain, and political pressure, yet perseverance and industrial technology ultimately triumphed. For the world, the canal symbolized the power of human ingenuity and the reach of industrial progress. Steamships, telegraphs, and railways already connected continents, and the Suez Canal became a crucial artery in this emerging global network. For Ahmed and his fellow laborers, it was a monument to toil, vision, and the promise of a modern world reshaped by industry. The Erie Canal, connecting America, 1825. The early morning sun glinted off the muddy waters of the Mohawk River as laborers toiled along the unfinished canal banks. Horses plodded through soft soil, pulling carts of earth, while men dug, shoveled, and reinforced wooden lock gates. Among them was young Jacob Thompson, barely 17, who had left his family farm in upstate New York to work on what many called Clinton's Ditch, after Governor DeWitt Clinton, the canal's chief advocate. The Erie Canal was ambitious. Stretching over 360 miles from Albany to Buffalo, it promised to link the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes, revolutionizing trade and settlement. Jacob's hands were blistered from shoveling, and his back ached from long days, but he felt a sense of purpose. Every lock completed, every section dug, brought the promise of new markets, faster transport, and the possibility of turning isolated frontier towns into thriving communities. Engineers faced countless challenges: uneven terrain, swampy marshes, and the unpredictable currents of rivers. Wooden locks had to be carefully constructed to manage water levels. Aqueducts carried water across valleys, and innovative techniques allowed the canal to maintain a gentle slope over hundreds of miles. Every day, Jacob marveled at the ingenuity required, realizing that human labor alone could not have succeeded without careful planning and engineering. By 1825, the canal was complete. Jacob and his fellow workers lined the banks for the inaugural journey, as Governor Clinton famously rode along the waterway in a ceremonial procession. Boats laden with goods, wheat, lumber, and furs glided from the Great Lakes to New York City in a fraction of the previous time. Merchants celebrated the reduction in transport costs. Farmers saw their crops reach distant markets, and settlers moved westward with newfound speed and security. The Erie Canal transformed not just commerce, but the daily lives of those who built and used it. Towns along its route flourished with inns, warehouses, and mills. Families like Jacob's could now send goods and receive products from distant regions. It also symbolized America's industrial ambition, demonstrating that coordinated labor, engineering ingenuity, and political will could reshape the landscape and connect people across vast distances. Jacob looked back at the water shimmering under the sunset, imagining future generations traveling this path, commerce flowing freely, and the frontier shrinking. The Erie Canal was more than a waterway. It was a lifeline, a testament to human determination, and a cornerstone of America's industrial and economic growth. The steel industry in Pittsburgh, Carnegie and the Age of Iron, 1870s–1880. The smoke of Pittsburgh's skyline hung thick over the Allegheny River, blending with the fiery glow of molten steel pouring from massive furnaces. Andrew Carnegie, walking through his homestead plant, observed the synchronized chaos with a keen eye. Steam engines hissed, cranes groaned under iron beams, and workers, many recent immigrants, moved tirelessly amidst sparks and heat. Among them was 19-year-old Pietro Rossi, who had sailed from Italy seeking opportunity. Every day he fed coal into the blast furnaces, monitored temperatures, and adjusted molds to ensure molten steel flowed correctly. The work was grueling and dangerous. Burns, explosions, and collapsing scaffolds were constant threats. Yet the promise of steady wages, advancement, and a foothold in America drove Pietro and thousands like him to endure the hazards. Carnegie's innovation lay not only in scale but in process. The adoption of the Bessemer converter allowed steel to be produced faster, cheaper, and in larger quantities than ever before. Bridges, railways, and skyscrapers across the nation would rely on this steel. Industrial efficiency and careful management transformed Pittsburgh from a regional town into the Steel City, the backbone of America's industrial economy. Yet the human cost was stark. Laborers faced 12 to 16-hour shifts, minimal safety protections, and the constant pressure of productivity. Tensions occasionally flared into strikes and disputes, as workers demanded fair wages, better conditions, and recognition of their vital role in the industrial machine. Carnegie himself navigated these tensions, balancing profit, innovation, and social unrest, often sparking debates about labor rights that would continue for decades. For Pietro, the clang of steel was both music and menace. Each beam he helped shape symbolized progress, wealth, and the incredible potential of human industry. Simultaneously, it reminded him of the fragility of life in the industrial age, where opportunity and danger existed side by side. By the 1880s, Pittsburgh stood as a testament to ambition, innovation, and transformation. Steel had become more than a material. It was the foundation of a new world, shaping cities, economies, and the lives of millions. The city's furnaces burned hot with possibility, and each spark told the story of labor, ingenuity, and the relentless drive of the Industrial Revolution. The Gaslight Revolution, illuminating cities, 1810 to 1840. The streets of London at night had long been shrouded in darkness, lit only by flickering candles or lanterns, leaving alleyways shadowed and dangerous. That changed with the rise of gas lighting. By the 1810s, gas lamps began illuminating streets, shops, and public squares, transforming urban life and creating a sense of safety and wonder. Among the early workers maintaining these lamps was 16-year-old Samuel Bennett. Each evening, he climbed iron poles to light burners, adjust valves, and ensure the gas flowed steadily. Flames flickered to life, casting a warm glow over cobblestones, reflecting off shop windows and guiding pedestrians safely through the city. The work was meticulous and sometimes perilous, yet Samuel took pride in brightening the streets and shaping this new era of urban life. Gas lighting did more than illuminate. It reshaped the rhythm of the city. Shops could stay open later, theaters extended performances, and public gatherings thrived well into the night. Crime declined in some areas, as dark corners disappeared and vigilance increased. Social life expanded. Promenades, cafes, and public parks glimmered under rows of flickering flames, offering the city's residents new ways to enjoy their evenings. Yet the innovation came with challenges. Gas leaks could lead to fires or explosions, and maintenance required constant vigilance. Early adopters debated costs, aesthetics, and safety, while engineers worked tirelessly to expand networks of pipes and burners. Despite these obstacles, the public embraced the change, and cities across Britain and Europe followed London's lead. For Samuel and countless lamplighters, the glow of gas symbolized both progress and human ingenuity. It represented a bridge between technology and daily life, showing that industry could illuminate not only factories and workshops, but the very streets where people lived, worked, and socialized. The gaslight revolution was a quiet but profound part of the Industrial Revolution, casting light on society itself and signaling the dawn of modern urban life. The Railway Mania, Britain's iron roads, 1840s, 1850. The countryside of Britain in the 1840s trembled under the wheels of progress. Steam locomotives hissed and roared across newly laid tracks, connecting towns, cities, and ports at unprecedented speed. Investors speculated wildly on railway companies, engineers raced to design lines, and laborers dug, bridged, and tunneled across hills and valleys. Among them was 18-year-old Thomas Weaver, a surveyor's apprentice, charting curves, gradients, and bridges for the London-Birmingham Railway. Railway mania gripped the nation. Stocks soared as ordinary citizens invested life savings in proposed lines, dreaming of fortunes. Towns once isolated suddenly found themselves linked to major markets. Goods, news, and people traveled faster than ever before. Yet the mania was fueled by speculation and overambition. Some projects never reached completion, leaving investors bankrupt and towns frustrated at the dashed promises of progress. For laborers, the work was grueling and often perilous. Thomas watched gangs of men, many Irish immigrants, digging cuttings, building embankments, and laying iron rails under the watchful eyes of foremen. Accidents were common. Landslides, exploding steam engines, and collapsing bridges claimed lives daily. Still, the promise of employment and the thrill of participating in a transformative enterprise kept morale alive. The cultural impact of railways was profound. Travel, once slow and uncertain, became predictable and accessible. People could visit family in distant towns, attend fairs and theaters, and explore landscapes previously unreachable. Commerce accelerated. Perishable goods reached markets faster, coal and iron flowed efficiently, and industrial towns expanded in population and wealth. Yet the mania also demonstrated the risks of rapid industrial growth. Speculative bubbles, economic instability, and social displacement accompanied progress. Thomas understood that the iron roads were reshaping both geography and society, connecting distant lives, economies, and ambitions. By the 1850s, Britain's railway network had become the veins of industrial life, carrying the lifeblood of the nation and signaling a world moving faster, louder, and closer than ever before. The Industrial Exhibition of Paris, 1867. The Champ de Mars in Paris gleamed under the summer sun as visitors streamed toward the newly erected exhibition halls. The 1867 Exposition Universelle was a celebration of industry, science, and culture, drawing inventors, engineers, and entrepreneurs from around the world. Among them was young French engineer Émile Dupont, eager to see the latest machinery, textiles, and innovations from Europe, America, and beyond. Inside the enormous glass and iron pavilions, inventions sparkled with ingenuity. Steam engines hissed, spinning machines whirred, and delicate telegraph equipment blinked with pulsing signals. Émile marveled at mechanical looms producing patterned fabrics in seconds, electrical experiments demonstrating the power of magnetism, and models of bridges and ships that hinted at a future shaped by engineering precision. The exhibition was both a marketplace and a classroom, inspiring awe in the public while promoting competition among industrial powers. For visitors like Émile, the exposition revealed the scale and ambition of the Industrial Revolution. Nations displayed their prowess through innovation, and inventors sought recognition, funding, and influence. Socially, the exhibition allowed workers, intellectuals, and the elite to witness the changing world, fostering debates on progress, labor, and the ethics of mechanization. Yet the exhibition also highlighted contrasts. While machines promised efficiency and growth, laborers in distant factories toiled under harsh conditions to produce the very goods celebrated in Paris. Émile reflected on the human cost hidden behind gleaming innovations: the children in textile mills, the miners underground, and the immigrant laborers in burgeoning industrial cities. As the sun set over the Seine, Émile walked among exhibits of steamships, telegraphs, and ornate machinery, realizing that the Industrial Revolution was not merely a European phenomenon but a global movement. It reshaped commerce, urban life, and human ambition. The Paris exhibition symbolized the age's optimism and its challenges, a world illuminated by progress, yet shadowed by labor, inequality, and the relentless pace of industrial change. The Steamship Revolution, Brunel and the SS Great Britain, 1843. The shipyard on the banks of the river Avon was alive with the clamor of hammers, cranes, and riveters. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, tall and imposing, strode among the workers, inspecting the iron plates that would form the hull of the SS Great Britain, the world's first iron-hulled, screw-propelled passenger ship. Young apprentice William Carter, barely 16, marveled at the massive frames, the smell of hot iron, and the heat of the furnaces shaping plates into curve-perfect sections. Brunel's vision was revolutionary. Traditional wooden ships were limited by size and durability. Steam engines had yet to reach full efficiency. The SS Great Britain combined iron construction with a powerful screw propeller, allowing faster, safer, and more reliable ocean travel. Engineers and laborers alike understood the stakes. This ship could redefine transatlantic commerce, passenger travel, and naval engineering. Every day, William carried rivets, checked alignment, and polished engines. Sparks flew, steel rang, and sweat dripped down the faces of men and boys. Accidents were common, but the sense of participating in history outweighed fear. The challenges were immense: securing a watertight hull, designing a balanced propeller, and integrating steam engines capable of sustaining long voyages. In 1843, the SS Great Britain was launched. The crowd gasped as the massive iron vessel slid into the water, steam engines humming, smoke curling from its funnel. Its maiden voyage across the Atlantic was both thrilling and tense, as passengers and crew witnessed the future of maritime travel. Brunel's ship not only proved the viability of iron hulls and screw propulsion, but inspired engineers around the globe to embrace bold innovation. For William, the ship symbolized human ingenuity and ambition. The Industrial Revolution was no longer confined to factories and railways. It had expanded to the seas, connecting continents, accelerating trade, and shrinking the world. The SS Great Britain was a floating testament to the era's spirit, fearless, inventive, and transformative. Child labor in the mines. Voices of the young, 1830s, 1850. The mines of northern England were dark, suffocating, and perilous. 12-year-old Samuel Hughes crawled through narrow shafts, carrying baskets of coal far heavier than his small frame should manage. The air was thick with dust, the echo of pickaxes reverberating off stone walls, and the constant threat of collapse or gas explosions. Children like Samuel were essential to the mining economy. Their small bodies could navigate tight tunnels, attend to delicate machinery, and transport coal to carts. Yet the physical toll was enormous. Exhaustion, injury, respiratory disease, and stunted growth were constant companions. Families relied on their wages, balancing the grim calculus of survival against the dangers of industrial labor. Reformers like Lord Shaftesbury began a campaign for change, visiting mines, factories, and workshops to document the harsh conditions. Samuel once saw a gentleman take notes, express shock at the number of children working, and promised to advocate for laws limiting labor hours and improving safety. For Samuel and his peers, these reforms were both hopeful and distant. Daily life demanded that they work, often in silence, enduring toil their parents had endured before them. Despite the hardships, children formed bonds of camaraderie, shared stories, and found small moments of play during brief breaks. These acts of resilience preserved their humanity amid the machinery and coal dust. The Industrial Revolution depended on their labor, but also gradually exposed society to the moral cost of progress, sparking debates, laws, and reforms that would slowly transform child labor practices in Britain. The invention of the spinning jenny, Hargreaves' breakthrough, 1764. In a small cottage in Lancashire, James Hargreaves worked late into the night, surrounded by spools, threads, and hand-carved wooden gears. He was experimenting with a device that could spin multiple threads at once, a solution born of frustration with the slow, laborious process of traditional spinning wheels. Young apprentice Thomas Allen watched, wide-eyed as the machine hummed, transforming cotton into several threads simultaneously. The spinning jenny was a modest wooden frame with 8 spindles at first, capable of spinning multiple threads with a single turn of the wheel. For weavers and spinners, it promised to multiply output, reduce labor, and increase income. Yet for many traditional workers, it was a threat. Machines could replace skilled artisans, disrupt cottage industries, and spark resistance. Hargreaves' invention spread quickly through Lancashire. Families adapted their homes to accommodate multiple machines, and small workshops flourished. Yet the speed and efficiency of mechanized spinning drew the attention of industrialists, setting the stage for larger factories and the eventual shift from home-based cottage industry to urban mills. Thomas marveled at the spinning jenny's power, understanding that it was not just a tool, but a symbol of the Industrial Revolution itself. It represented innovation, disruption, and the unstoppable march of mechanization. Hargreaves' simple invention paved the way for the textile industry's explosive growth, altering lives, economies, and the social fabric of England forever. The Industrial Revolution in Japan. Meiji modernization, 1870–1880. The streets of Yokohama were a mix of traditional wooden houses, rickshaws, and the sharp clatter of horse-drawn carts carrying goods from newly built factories. In 1872, Japan was undergoing a transformation unlike any it had seen. The Meiji Restoration had opened the nation to Western technology, and industrialization was spreading rapidly. Among the workers was 20-year-old Kenta Mori, who had left his family farm to work in a textile factory powered by steam engines imported from Britain. Kenta's days began before sunrise. Steam-powered looms clattered endlessly, producing silk and cotton fabrics for both domestic use and export. Japanese engineers, often trained abroad, adapted Western machinery to local needs, while workers like Kenta learned new techniques and faced long hours in hot, noisy, and crowded workshops. The shift from agrarian life to factory labor was a shock to body and mind, yet it also offered opportunity, steady wages, urban life, and access to education programs funded by the government. Railways carved iron paths across the countryside, connecting Yokohama to Tokyo, Osaka, and distant ports. Kenta occasionally marveled at the steam locomotives, their power dwarfing anything he had known as a child. Coal-powered engines and telegraph lines symbolized the new industrial age, shrinking distances and accelerating trade. Japan's rulers viewed industrialization not merely as economic growth, but as a defense against colonial powers, believing that mastery of Western technology was essential for national sovereignty. Yet industrialization brought challenges. Urban life was crowded and unsanitary. Workers suffered from respiratory issues and fatigue. Traditional social structures were strained as young men and women migrated to cities, leaving villages depopulated. Labor unrest occasionally flared, with workers petitioning for better conditions, shorter hours, and protection from accidents in factories filled with unfamiliar machinery. For Kenta, the factory represented a new Japan. He witnessed the tension between tradition and innovation, between the old wooden world and the new iron and steam cities rising around him. Every spool of thread he spun, every fabric he helped produce, was part of a national transformation, linking labor, technology, and ambition. The Meiji Industrial Revolution was not just about machines. It was about forging a modern nation, and Kenta felt himself at the heart of history unfolding, one clattering loom and one coal-fired engine at a time. The telegraph and financial markets, connecting London and New York, 1850 to 1860. The offices of London's Royal Exchange were alive with the clatter of ticker machines, the scratching of pens, and the low hum of conversation. In the corner, a young clerk named Edward Parker monitored the telegraph, a marvel of industrial ingenuity that had shrunk the distance between continents. For the first time, stock prices, market news, and commercial intelligence could travel across the Atlantic almost instantly, linking London and New York in a shared economic heartbeat. Edward's days were a whirlwind of signals, codes, and urgent messages. Telegraph operators tapped Morse code into machines, transmitting information about cotton futures, railway shares, and commodity prices. The impact on trade was profound. Investors could act on market developments hours, rather than weeks after events occurred. Banks coordinated loans, merchants adjusted shipments, and brokers made rapid decisions that reshaped fortunes overnight. The technology was impressive but fraught with tension. Cables beneath the Atlantic were vulnerable to storms, mechanical failure, and sabotage. Operators worked long shifts, deciphering codes under pressure, knowing that a single error could cost millions. Yet the telegraph revolutionized finance, creating a truly global marketplace. Commercial rivalries became instantaneous, and economies on opposite sides of the ocean were tightly interwoven. Edward observed how human ambition and industrial innovation intertwined. Stock speculation intensified. Fortunes were made and lost within hours. Merchants in New York and London relied on the technology to hedge risks, while governments and companies began to see the potential for faster diplomacy and commerce. For Edward, the telegraph was more than a machine. It was a thread linking continents, economies, and lives, demonstrating how industrial innovation could redefine time, space, and human interaction. By the 1860s, the telegraph had become indispensable. Its presence transformed the very notion of distance, accelerated trade, and introduced new forms of human connectivity. The Industrial Revolution, once anchored in steam, coal, and iron, now pulsed with electricity and information, and clerks like Edward were the quiet witnesses of a world suddenly smaller, faster, and ever more interdependent. Electricity in industry. The advent of electric power, 1880s. The factories of late 19th century New York and London hummed not only with steam, but with a new, invisible force: electricity. Among the innovators was Thomas Edison, whose incandescent lamps had begun replacing gas lighting, transforming both homes and factories. In a dimly lit workshop, apprentice Clara Whitman adjusted wires feeding into a prototype assembly line powered by electric motors. She marveled at the steady hum, so much quieter than the pounding steam engines she had grown accustomed to. Electricity changed the very rhythm of industrial labor. Machines no longer depended solely on belts and pulleys connected to central shafts. Individual motors allowed greater flexibility, speed, and precision. Factories could run longer hours with safer, brighter lighting. Workers could operate in conditions that had once been dark, hazardous, and exhausting. Productivity soared, and new industries, from chemicals to electronics, emerged almost overnight. Yet the transition was not simple. Wiring had to be carefully installed, switches and motors required maintenance, and safety standards were minimal. Electric shocks, fires, and equipment failures were constant hazards. Still, engineers and laborers adapted, recognizing that electricity would redefine the future of work, communication, and transportation. For business owners, the benefits were transformative. Assembly lines powered by electricity could produce goods faster and with higher precision, reducing costs and expanding markets. Urban infrastructure also changed. Streetcars, trams, and elevators began running on electric power, reshaping cities and daily life. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun with steam and coal, now embraced a new force capable of lighting homes, powering factories, and accelerating progress. Clara stood among the glowing machines, realizing that she was witnessing the dawn of a new age. Industrial labor, global trade, and urban life were all being reimagined. Electricity promised efficiency, speed, and innovation on a scale previously unimaginable. The revolution that had begun with steam, steel, and cotton had entered a luminous new chapter, lighting the path toward the modern world. Thank you for listening to Lucid Dreams History. If you made it this far, like and subscribe. Good night.